Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome.
Hello, hello.
Oh, hello. Hi, Ashot.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Everyone, welcome.
Good morning. Hi,
Good
Jim. Hi, everyone.
Hi, is that you, Jeanette? Hi, Jeanette. Boy, it's good to see you after all these years.
Lo mismo, igualmente, Jim. Un gustazo estar aquí hoy.
Uh,
That's the great thing about these online sessions, to see people that you might not have been able to after many years. So, okay, well, we have some people still joining us, but I would like to go ahead and get started so we can have as much time as possible to hear from Jim and to have some time for question and answers at the end. So let's make sure we're all good here. Yep. So let's see. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us today on this session hosted by us, the Center for Protected Area Management, and sponsored by the U.S. Forest Service International Programs. This session would not be possible without their support, so thank you to them, big shout out, and also would not be possible without you all who are joining us today. So, and doing the great work that you're doing. So this session today is focused on visitor management and public use zoning with our CPAM co-founder, Jim Wurz. My name is Audrey Ramsey. I'm the training coordinator for the center, and I will be serving kind of as the MC for this session. This session is part of the Center's Sustainable Tourism Community of Learning and Practice, which is an evolution of the Sustainable Tourism Seminar, which some of you may have participated in previous years, pre-pandemic, of course. And this ongoing community of learning and practice is designed to connect and empower and highlight the fantastic work and practices of sustainable tourism professionals worldwide. The community of learning and practice has many opportunities to get engaged, like this one, like technical webinars focused on sustainable tourism topics that have been identified as high interest from our current cohort of the program. We also host something called Tourism Talk Tuesdays, which are kind of like open Zoom meetings with no particular agenda that anyone can attend and come and talk about anything tourism. So anything that's on your mind, news, what you're working on. It's just an open kind of like coffee hour to come and chat and connect with people from all over the world, whoever decides to show up that day. We also have our podcast, which we released last year called Protecting Hope. We now have 6 episodes out, and you can find that on our website, on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and pretty much anywhere you can get podcasts. And that podcast is really focused on highlighting great things that people are doing across the world in sustainable tourism. And we really like to highlight some of the work that our past participants are doing as well. So you can hear some of the things that our past participants have been doing on there. So we also will be hosting our first biennial conference on sustainable tourism in protected areas this September, which will be September 24th through 26th of this year, 2024. And it will be free online conference. So we'll have about 2 hours of presentations each day, and each day will have a different theme associated with the day. So we will be launching the registration for that in May's timeframe-ish. So check back with our Facebook and our website for more information then on how to register for those sorts of things. And I'm going to have Melina, who's here helping me with our tech, post in the chat some of the links to our website where you can find the Protecting Hope podcast, as well as the ongoing community of learning and practice events, where you can find out where to register for all these different things that we have going on. And then also the calendar of events, which we have for spring of 2024. And then we'll come out with one for kind of our fall activities a little later in the year. So And then I also have some information, some PDFs that I'm going to be sharing in the chat after I pass it over to Jim with some resources that Jim is going to be referring to throughout this presentation. So I will put those PDFs in the chat. And yeah, so this session, just so everyone knows, is going to be about an hour long. We will do our best to get you out at the top of the hour. And we'll have about 35-minute presentation from Jim, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So please put your questions in the chat as we go throughout the session, and we will do our best to get to as many as we can at the end. And this is a meeting format of a Zoom, so we can have more like fluid discussion after Jim's presentation. So please keep your microphones on mute during the presentation. That would be much appreciated. But once the presentation is done and we go to question and answers, feel free to put questions in the chat during the session or after, or when we open it up, you can just kind of raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask a question as well. So that's what I have for you now. I will hand it over to Jim to tell us a little more about himself and get us started on visitor management. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Audrey. I'm seeing a lot of names that I know, people signing up for entering this meeting. Many of you I haven't been in touch with for a lot of years, so it's good to see your names. And I suppose you can say, look how old Jim got. But anyway, happens to all of us. My name, as it says here, is Jim Wurz. I taught for about 30 years at Colorado State University in protected area management and land use planning courses. And also, as Audrey mentioned, I'm one of the founding affiliates of the Center for Protected Area Management, where we've, well, if you're signed up for this meeting, you know what CPAM does. Audrey and Ryan asked me to talk about visitor management protected areas for about 30 minutes, which is pretty hard to do. It's a broad topic. It would be like saying, I'm going to take 10 minutes to tell you how to maintain a car or a truck. I could mention changing the oil and keeping the coolant topped off and periodically replacing your timing belt and your rear axle oil and your differential oil. But after that 10 minutes, it's not like you'd be able to walk away and say, I've got it. I know everything I need to know. Luckily, a lot of you, if not most of you, have been working in protected area management and visitor management for a long time. So what I'm going to talk about is, rather than specific details or just reminding you of things you probably already know, but things that I think bear repeating from time to time. This is based on discussions I've had over many years with protected area managers. I've worked with planners, with rangers in the field, and also based on the research, the body of research about visitor management, and also my own observations. So you're free to disagree with anything I say. Tell me I've lost my mind in my retirement. I'm either retired or semi-retired. I'm not sure which yet. But let's get started. A little bit about, I've got to figure out how to, there we go. I don't know if the rest of you can see this whole slide. I'm not seeing it all, but anyway, I know what's on the slides, you don't yet. In general, I just wanted to talk about why we're doing visitor management and revisit the whole idea of visitors, what a hassle visitors can be, you know, and so let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about direct versus indirect management, what some of the options are for managing visitors, and also public use zoning. As I said, I'm going to touch on these things, There are a couple of documents that Audrey mentioned that I sent that will be posted. They're just in PDF form to give you a little more detail about things. And then I'm very happy to listen to your comments and questions, and you feel free to email me as well. So when we talk about managing visitors, what we're really talking about is trying our best to limit the negative impacts they have in protected areas and around protected areas. So they can have negative impacts to vegetation, soil. They can disturb wildlife, impacts to water and air quality. They have negative impacts to themselves a lot of times by doing things that we would consider, to put it kindly, ill-advised, but to put it less kindly, stupid. And sometimes people do things that get themselves in trouble, and managers end up needing to search for them or rescue them. They can have negative impacts on the experiences of other visitors through disturbing behavior or through conflicts. And one of the biggest impacts, negative impacts they can have, is on adjacent communities, what are often called gateway communities. It's well documented that in many gateway communities, housing that used to go to local residents has been converted into short-term vacation rentals, which drives up the cost of rent and home ownership. Sometimes stores that used to sell staples like food and clothing for local residents have been converted into souvenir shops. And so that has a negative impact on the cost of living and the difficulty of living in adjacent communities, besides just the potential for more traffic, more crowding, things like that. And that's a part of visitor management as well, for protected area managers to coordinate with local leaders to make sure that the impacts to adjacent communities are more positive than negative. So with all these negative impacts, why do we even bother with visitors? Wouldn't it be so much simpler if we could just get their money without having them actually come? Just put a fence around everything and let nature take its course. Well, and I know that this question has been answered long ago, but I've also known a lot of rangers who encountered the same problems hour after hour, day after day. And even if they don't think it consciously, sometimes subconsciously, they can develop an attitude of visitors are kind of the problem. Visitors are, it would be so great if we just didn't have visitors. And I think it bears thinking about this from time to time, just to readjust our attitudes. Let's just imagine that it were possible to keep everybody out of a protected area, put a fence around it, keep them all out. You know, wouldn't nature be wonderful if we could do that? Well, we know that that can't happen. There are human impacts that enter a protected area, even if people don't physically enter. The big one is climate change, but also the smoke from wildfires, noise pollution, light pollution, which we know now affects the reproductive success and affects the behavior of wildlife. Exotic flora and fauna can enter protected areas even without people entering, seeds dispersed by birds, etc. So we know it's impossible to avoid human-caused impacts, even if it were possible to keep people out. But we also know it's impossible to keep people out. In many ranger training courses that CPAM has done, we have gone on deep patrols with rangers in areas that supposedly were intangible areas or off limits to all public visitors. And we've encountered the encroachment of agricultural practices, marijuana fields, looted archaeological sites, the garbage and remnants of researcher camps. All of these things, people go into places even when they're not supposed to go into places. And in CPAM, we've long believed that it's better to have visitors who are there legally, who generally support the mission and the objectives of the protected area, than it is to have other people in there who really have no interest in that protected area, other than what they can take out of it. And when we talk about making sure that visitors are in there, it's also important that those visitors are not just international visitors, are not just foreign visitors. They bring in a lot of money, it's true, but the people who really in the long term will support a protected area are the local people and the national citizens. It's important that protected areas find a way to include those people, because they're the ones who vote, they're the ones who pay with their taxes. And tourism, international tourists can be fickle. They can change their minds. One bad piece of news coverage can make tourism drop dramatically. And so it's really important to have local people and national citizens who support the protected area system. So let's talk about direct versus indirect management. Very often it's common, I think, and it's common not just in protected areas, but all throughout life. You encounter something that you see as a problem and you think, there ought to be a law against this. There ought to be a rule against doing this. And essentially, direct management is management that sets rules, that tries to act directly on the behavior of the visitor. My next slide will show that. We'll give a little graphic of it, but indirect management involves educating the visitor, giving the visitor the information that's necessary to allow that person to behave in an appropriate way. So if you look up here in the upper slide, it says you need permission. You must have permission from a ranger to come ashore. That's direct management. That's a rule. And over to the right, the sign says it's prohibited to cut timber, to hunt, to have fires, to burn things. That's direct management. Indirect management, an example would be this one on the lower left from Parque Nacional El Imposible in El Salvador. It loosely translated, it says friend visitor. What a great way to start it to begin with. It's such a welcoming salutation. But friend visitor, garbage can change the life process of this forest. There is garbage that degrades easily, but plastics, aluminum cans, and glass don't degrade. The wastes in this area can last more than 200 years before they decompose. That's a loose translation. In other words, this just gives information to the visitor and assumes that the visitor is inclined to support the protected area and will then take from that to not throw trash on the ground. It's a different type of management. And as I mentioned, so indirect management focuses on providing the information that allows the visitor to make decisions and then behave appropriately. Direct management focuses on changing visitor behavior directly on the visitor. So which is better? there's not really an answer to that. They both can work. Indirect management is certainly less expensive, and it can help build a sense of collaboration between visitors and managers. But direct management can work too. And direct management, again, though, if you institute a rule, you have to be willing and able to enforce that rule. If you create a regulation and you don't enforce it, then it just creates resentment among the visitors who are following the rule, but are seeing other people breaking the rule without any consequences. So it's important to think about that too. Indirect management is probably more in line with the idea of visitation to a protected area. People are visiting protected areas voluntarily in their free time, and so it allows them some freedom and some decision-making autonomy. On the other hand, the research shows that visitors will accept direct management if they believe it's necessary to protect the natural resources in the area, or if they see it as being necessary to control the behavior of other people. This is probably part of human nature, where we think other people need the rules, but we don't need the rules. But so if people see it controlling other people's behavior, they will accept direct management. But in any case, any sort of action has a cost, and it's important to think about those costs to the visitor in terms of time, effort, financial costs, and autonomy, and to the institution, and also in the case of time, effort, personnel effort, the cost of infrastructure or enforcement, and also in public support. As I've said before, these things I'm sure most of you already know, and these are just reminders of things. There are a number of strategies that have been developed over many years. A lot of them were developed by researchers within the U.S. Forest Service. David Cole comes to mind as someone who did a lot of research about visitor impacts, and came up with matrices of different types of management tactics, visitor management tactics. And these are just some broad categories. One of the documents that Audrey and Melina are posting is just a more detailed list of different actions that are possible to take under each category. And there are many more actions, but it just depends on the situation. If you look at this list, you'll notice that the first category of tactics is to reduce the use of problem areas. Notice that I didn't include reduce the use of the entire protected area. And that's one that's somewhat controversial. I think it doesn't work very well because people don't tend to disperse themselves evenly within a protected area once they're inside it. And so most problems with crowding and with even with biophysical impacts occur at specific sites within a protected area rather than evenly over the whole place, over the whole park or protected area. And so just limiting the total number of people that can enter that protected area would be sort of like if you have not enough seats in a movie theater, so the way you deal with it is limit the number of people who can enter the city. You're still probably not going to have enough seats in the movie theater. And so, and it's not to say that that strategy is not used. As a matter of fact, the National Park Service, a number of parks are using that more and more. I would suggest that it's more out of desperation, being overwhelmed with visitors and the impacts of visitors, than actually dealing with a specific problem. That's not to say that it can't work at times, but in order for rationing of use to work, managers have to have three things. They have to have control of access to the area. Obviously, if you can't control the access, then what's the point of trying to limit visitation? Once people are in the area, they need to be able to control how people disperse and where they disperse. And third, they need to be able to control the behavior of visitors, because that's really what is going to be causing negative impacts in a lot of cases. And so sometimes that is possible. Arches National Park in the United States comes to mind. People visit that park, they enter through cars. And so, and the park says that you can't get out of your car unless you park it in a designated parking space, and there's a certain number of parking spaces. So in a sense, that's one way of controlling how people disperse once they get in the front gate. It controls how many, at least how many vehicles can be at a certain trailhead. On the other hand, it doesn't control the total number of people at a certain trailhead or on a trail, because you may have a car with 2 people, or you may have a van with 12 people. Excuse me. It's wintertime here in Colorado and the air is very dry. Anyway, so it's not that rationing of use in a protected area can't work, but it needs to be under certain conditions. There are different strategies for rationing use if it's appropriate. And the only thing that I'd like to point out here and remind you, excuse me, is that every method has its winners and losers. It favors certain types of visitors at the expense of others. So in the interest of fairness, I would suggest that it's important that managers use a combination of methods if they are going to ration use, 1 or 2 or 3 different methods to make sure that different people or different types of people have choices. I'll give you an example. Reservations are a very common way of rationing use. You have a certain time of day that you're allowed to arrive at a park. That favors people whose life schedules allow them to plan ahead. But there are many people, for instance, people who work in the construction industry, who don't always know when they have free days or time off. They finish one job and they don't know if there will be a few days off before another job starts, or they don't know if the weather is going to keep them from working on a construction project, and then they may have a day or two that they could visit a protected area. But if they can't make a reservation way in advance, they're excluded. So it's important to keep some different ways, like a first come, first served system, along with a reservation system, just in the interest of fairness. So with the different management tactics, how do we know which ones to use? Because certain tactics don't work in certain places and they work in others. And this is where I would say, look at the objectives of each specific site within the protected area as they are expressed by public use zoning. And this is something that public use zoning is a concept that has been in use, and it's been known for decades now. I think the U.S. Forest Service first started using this idea in the 1970s, so 50 years ago. it's something that seems fairly simple, but it is often complex to do well, to design, and in a generic. I don't know if you're losing me or not. I just got a thing saying my internet connection is not good. Am I still there? Okay. Okay, no rest for the weary. But anyway, in public use zoning usually comes into play in the beginning of a planning process when the planning team is defining the desired conditions in the area. And then later it comes into play when managers are deciding which specific tactics they want to use to address certain challenges and problems. I'll give a very basic example that's very common. If managers notice that there's a problem with litter in an area, sometimes the first response, or the tendency for the first response, is we'll put in more trash cans, more garbage barrels in the area. And that may be appropriate in a front country area, meaning a place near a visitor center or near restrooms, but it's completely inappropriate in a more primitive backcountry area that doesn't have much infrastructure and where people have to walk a long distance to get there. First of all, if you put it, and I've seen this before, a trash can in a very remote area, but forgetting that somebody has to empty that trash can. And so it's possible that those trash cans get full without anyone getting around to emptying them. So it's much better to generate an ethic of people carrying out their own garbage than to try and fix it with a trash can. That's just one real obvious example. In this context, a public use zone doesn't mean an ecological zone. We're not talking about ponderosa pine forest zone versus a grassland zone, or a dry tropical forest versus a wet tropical forest zone. What we're talking about here is zoning for public use regardless of which ecological zone it occurs in. And when I say a zone, that in this context, I also mean a setting, or I also mean an opportunity class, which is what some agencies, the term that some agencies use. And in other words, opportunities for visitors to experience different things. And the preferences visitors have for experiences can also be considered the same thing as their motivations for visiting. The second document that I gave to Audrey and Melina in the post is a more detailed presentation on public use zoning. Many of you are familiar with this. In a lot of countries, it's a requirement of the planning process. But I'm not talking either about just having an intensive use zone and an extensive use zone, or an intangible zone. It's I think, for the good of the protected area in terms of resource protection, and also in terms of providing opportunities for good visitor experiences, it's good to have a diversity of different zones there that would meet the needs of a diverse group of visitors. That doesn't mean that every protected area has to have 10 different types of visitors. Some places are very small and probably need just one or two different places, an entry area and another type of zone, however it's defined. Some places are large enough to have 5 or 6 or 7 different zones, or even more. That gets determined during the planning process. In general, there's a range, and for the most part, a primitive zone has less infrastructure. The management is more indirect, meaning people are given education before they go into that zone and then expected to act in a certain way. Access is more difficult. Usually it requires more, requires people to walk or maybe go in by horseback, but usually not motorized. And so it requires a higher level of skill, and usually there's a higher level of resource protection because it is less altered by human activity. And then at the other end of the spectrum would be urban type zones, which would be where a visitor center would be, and there may be a parking lot, and people can get there by car or by bus. There may be short paved interpretive trails. There may be public facilities like restrooms. There's more intensive infrastructure in those zones. And then there's all sorts of possibilities in between those two extremes. When the Forest Service first developed the recreation opportunity spectrum, I think there were 6 different zones that they defined. And in a lot of cases, they were defined by access. Could you drive into them, or did you need to walk into them? What was the standard for roads? Were they paved roads or were they dirt roads? Things like that. In the development of that recreation opportunity spectrum, the idea, and I have this directly from the people who were involved in that development, the idea was never that this would be a recipe, that this would be a template where we have 6 zones that will be used in every national forest. The idea is that in the planning process, zones are defined according to the needs and according to what's appropriate in that area. In CPAM, about 20 years ago, responding to requests from partners in Latin America, we worked with partners, with managers, and with academics from Latin America to develop a Latin American version of that sort of idea. We called it ROVAP, is for its the acronym for its name in Spanish, Range of Opportunities for Visitors to Protected Areas. And again, we came up with an illustration that listed 5 different types of public use zones, from pristine to urban. That was never meant to be a template. It was never meant to be a recipe. Each protected area should develop its own range of zones according to what's appropriate to that area. So just very quickly, the different zones are defined in terms of their biophysical settings, their social settings, and their administrative settings. And biophysically does not mean, again, a specific ecosystem. It has more to do with how natural an area seems, or how evident the impacts of human changes are in that area. There we go. How the area can be accessed. Can you drive into it? Can you drive through it? Or are you limited to walking in? Can you ride a bicycle in? You know, there are different types of access that help define what that zone is like. How remote is it? And by remote, I mean not just how far away it is from a certain place, but when you're in that zone, how far away are you from the sights and sounds of other human activities? Like if you're in that zone, can you still hear a highway? Or can you see cars? Or can you see a lot of other people? That has to do with remoteness. Typically, the more primitive zones are larger, and they focus more on the protection of natural processes. And there's also how difficult it is, how much challenge or skill is necessary to visit a certain type of zone. And finally, topography and vegetation but not specific. We're not talking about specific species here. We're talking about the things that determine the feeling of remoteness. Up and down topography can give a feeling of remoteness even if you're not far away from other human activities, and vegetation can screen other human activities as well. The social setting can be defined by the number of encounters people have with others. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to do with the number of people in that zone, because of topography or because of vegetation. There may be a lot of people in that zone that you don't see, but the number of encounters can change the social setting. But if you look in the picture in the lower right, that is from Arches National Park in the US. There are a lot of people. This is a trail, and it's impossible because of the lack of vegetation. It's a desert park, to really feel like you're alone or in nature, that you've gotten away from other people. It also has to do with where you encounter other groups. If you've hiked for 4 or 5 hours and you encounter a lot of other people, it creates more of a psychological disturbance than if you're seeing people right at the entrance to a zone or at a parking lot. The types of users and the way they behave, group size is a big determinant of that social setting, and also how evident impacts are. And that's something that managers have a lot of control over, if they can eliminate the evidence of impacts as soon as they notice them. And then the administrative setting has to do with management itself. How obvious it is that visitors are being controlled by certain management tactics. The presence of agency or area personnel in the area, how often they encounter rangers, the amount of infrastructure and the type of infrastructure. Some zones will just have a very primitive trail. Other zones, as I mentioned, would have a visitor center and pavement, paved trails. The regulations that people need to follow, and also what arrangements they have to make to visit that area. Do they need to have a reservation? Do they need to pay an entrance fee? Those sorts of things. So I've come to believe over the years that public use zoning is one of the most important planning tools for visitor management, because it avoids the problem of managers responding to challenges by either instituting policies that are inappropriate in a certain area, or by investing in infrastructure that would be inappropriate in certain sites. And so it allows for different levels of altering the landscape, but the level of protection is the same in each zone. In an urban zone, you've altered the landscape a lot, but you still protect the conditions in that urban zone. In a more primitive zone, there's very little alteration, but those more primitive conditions are protected as well. Without specifically defining zones, the tendency is everything moves towards more and more development. The loss of the pristine, the loss of the primitive in favor of more and more urban type development. And I'm sure we've all seen that in our lifetimes, both inside and outside of protected areas. And so I think that this is an important tool to define the conditions that would be appropriate in each area. And this can be defined conceptually at the beginning of the planning process. And then later on, those zones or opportunity classes are applied to the map or to the terrain. So we know exactly where we can put a visitor center. We know exactly where it's appropriate to put facilities like restrooms, what type of trail would be appropriate in a certain place, what types of regulations are appropriate in a certain place. So this is how we protect the integrity of our area and make sure that we don't waste money on projects that don't make sense. I'm sure that many of you have seen, as I have seen, visitor centers that are in the very center of a large protected area, where in the most pristine part, the most scenic part of a protected area, where people have to drive all through the place to get to a visitor center, where it would have been much more appropriate to have the visitor center right at the entrance to a protected area and leave those more pristine and primitive areas alone, or minimally affect them with just trails and minimal signage, so to protect those more pristine conditions. I want to end this by pointing you to an effort called the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council. This is all of the land management agencies in the United States who have been dealing with these visitor management issues and planning issues for a number of years, and decided to come together, to work together to come up with some general policies that they use for both planning and management. And this is the website that you can access. And they've, over the last 10 years or so, they've developed a number of publications that you may find helpful. You know, you may decide that this isn't for us in our areas, but you may find it helpful. And I believe that's it, all I wanted to present, but I'm happy to hear comments, questions. No personal attacks, please.
I doubt anyone has any personal attacks after that great presentation, Jim. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone.
Thank you.
See some people's faces.
Yeah,
I
I'm
haven't seen. I feel free to
seeing
turn
names
my
from the
camera.
past.
Yeah. I haven't seen any questions in the chat. So if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to send something in the chat, or just go ahead and raise your hand. You can do it like this. You can do it through Zoom. You can just come off of mute and chat if you'd like. But we'll have about a little less than 10 minutes to do questions and answers. But thanks so much, Jim. That was great.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm gonna scroll through some of these mini comments
Yeah, go ahead.
here, or chat things, and see if there's anything.
Go ahead. Okay, we have one question to start us off. Go ahead and kick us off, Bonnie.
Of
Hey,
course.
Bonnie.
Hey. So, Jim, you talk a lot about the importance of the planning process, and many protected areas go through a pretty regimented process, but it doesn't happen very often. How have you come across ways when the use of a protected area starts to escalate or change, when you're not in a place where you've done your planning, or it's been done and it's not going to be in its next cycle for a few years? How have you addressed that as with managers, to try and get some things in place before, all the wheels fall off the car?
That's a great question. And I'm not sure I have a definitive answer, but I can tell you that what I've seen, and I think this is fairly common actually. It's a luxury sometimes to be able to say, okay, nobody come here until we have a plan in place for you. And the history of protected areas in general, has been that they start out with sort of random visitation, like in the United States. And over time, managers try to catch up. I think what happens a lot is, or what I think makes sense a lot, and what I've seen happen is to start by allowing very limited types of activities to occur in a place, because it's much easier to broaden the types of opportunities that are available once there's the management capacity for that, than it is to try and get rid of inappropriate uses or levels of use once they've occurred. But I think what a lot of protected areas have done is come up with an annual operational plan and sort of define their objectives as best they can, just to get through the next year and figure out what sort of actions they can take to try and maintain a certain level of protection before things get out of control. But it's not really a substitute for coming up with a true public use plan that will guide an area for a number of years. I don't know if that answers your question. Hi, Steve.
Yeah, I think it just points to the fact that our hands aren't tied. We may need to not be able to do as much as we want to do, as aggressively as we want to do, but just throwing our hands up is probably not going to help anything either.
Right.
So we can look at annual plans, or, hey, can we do a demonstration to test different things in preparation for our new plan, or, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and it goes back to that idea too of that our colleague Jim Barbarack talks about a lot. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
And we can't just stop, as you say, and say, well, we don't have all the money, we don't have all the time, we don't have all the personnel. But I do think that until those resources are in place, it's important to try and maintain control of that area and to open things up very slowly. A perfect example is the use of mountain bikes, which nobody really foresaw. You know, a few people in California in the 1970s were building mountain bikes, but nobody knew that was going to be a major issue in protected areas, and it's still a major issue in the United States. In you know, with the pressure to allow mountain bikes in wilderness areas where they're not allowed, and the same thing with jet skis. You know, in coastal areas that wasn't expected. And so I think it's important to keep that control until the management capacity is there to deal with it. I noticed, Steve McCool, that you had something.
Yeah.
I'm sure
Yeah.
you've got a lot of wisdom to add.
Well, not that much, Jim, but thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to add to this latest question. It's kind of one of a big dilemma in nature-based tourism here. On the one hand, we develop very rigid planning processes, like what happens in the Forest Service, where their plans are supposed to be written for 10 years and then often aren't modified for many years after that. And on the other hand, the environment in which nature-based tourism occurs is changing all the time. It's filled with disturbances. So here we have this activity occurring in a place that's incredibly varied over time and space, and yet we can't really plan for that. We haven't learned to plan for that, and that's a big dilemma. And one of the problems that we have, I think, is we've developed this attitude that's promoted by college professors, sort of like us, that planning is an event. and that occurs rarely and not a continuous process. That maybe we develop, and maybe in response to that, we develop a more strategic kind of plan, and then make these annual changes in operations or whatever to reflect the changes that are occurring. And you know, the thing that stimulated a lot of this thinking about the resilience of managing nature-based tourism is COVID-19. Okay, that is really stimulated. Oh, we live in this environment. We work in this environment that's constantly changing and subject to forces that we really don't understand or expect. So just some comments about the nature of our planning processes.
No, I think I appreciate that. And I think that's a really important point. I know that a lot of schematics or graphics about planning processes show planning as being sort of circular. You keep going back and back. I think really it's more of a spiral where you still have your mission and your large scale objectives for an area, but you keep circling back to the specific conditions that you're hoping to protect, or the specific opportunities you're hoping to protect, and seeing what's changed and what hasn't changed. I think an example of what you're talking about is what happens in certain public use zones after a wildfire. And, you know, you could still allow people into that zone, but you have to plan then that you're going to have a lot more trail maintenance, a lot more, potentially more injuries eventually from falling trees, you know, those sorts of things. Or you know, what we encountered in the West, the pine beetle epidemic that left a lot of standing dead forests that stand for a while, and then 20 years later, those trees start to fall. And so those are good examples, I think, of changes that can happen. And I think that's going to happen, especially in wildlife areas, with the movement of wildlife as the climate changes. You know, that there's so many examples, actually. Okay, well, I'm overwhelmed. I'm out of here. There's a lot that happens. Anybody else?
We do have 2 more questions in the
2
chat.
minutes.
Yeah,
more
we got 2
questions?
minutes. So I don't know if we have time for another question, unfortunately.
Where are they? I don't, can you
in the
just tell
chat.
me what
I
the
can read
question is?
you, I'll read you one of them, and then the other one, I'm going to connect you to this person directly.
Okay.
So the one that we have is, what opinion do you have about targeting a certain audience with greater purchasing power? For example, if we offer a more primitive experience. 30-second answer, go.
My 30-second answer, this has to do with my own values. For me, protected areas are for everybody. They're for the public. And I know that my own feeling, in a perfect world, protected areas would get the public funding they need. I know that there are a lot of guided trips that are expensive, but I think the goal should be to make those as economically accessible to a broad segment of the population as possible. I think people support protected areas based on their hearts, not on their brains or on their wallets. And people have to have the experience of nature, I think, in order to really feel that emotional support that will lead to the long-term future of protected areas. I don't even know if that answered the question, but I know it went for 30 seconds.
That was a great answer. Thank you very much, and inspiring too. So perfect way to end the session. Thank you all so much for coming today. Thank you, Jim, for the presentation.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah. And thanks for being part of our ongoing Sustainable Tourism Community of Learning and Practice, hosted by the Center for Protected Area Management and sponsored by the U.S. Forest Service International Programs. Thank you all. We do have one more session coming up, a webinar on May 15th, which is going to be with our very own Bonnie Limpet. Bonnie, you can give a little wave. There she is. And that's going to be at the same time, 8 o'clock Colorado time. We're going to talk about interpretive planning with Bonnie. So we hope to see you all there. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you next time. Bye,
All right.
everyone.
Thank you. And some names are jumping out at me.
Bye-bye. See you.
Thank you,
Edgar
Jim.
and Mario. Yeah, thank you, Bonnie.
Thank
and
you.
Elena, and there's so many names. It's great to see your names again. Yeah. All right.
In case anyone wants to say hi.
Yeah. Have a good day, everyone.
Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.
Gracias, Jim. Un gusto verte y oírte. Saludos de Bolivia.
Gracias, Jimena.
Okay, bye. Bye.